This is week 4 of our Lenten study looking at the children of the Bible. The last 3 weeks we've been looking at the Hebrew scriptures, the children of the matriarchs and patriarchs, the girls that stand out in the Hebrew tradition, and the boys who rose up to have particular leadership. A lot more boys, of course, than girls, but some boys were particularly singled out. This week we're looking at the childhood of Jesus. And inevitably, when I do anything about the childhood of Jesus, someone says to me, well, there's not that much. We don't know that much about Jesus, or it's not even mentioned in the Bible. Part of that is because, for some reason, the lectionary chooses the Sunday after Christmas to have the stories of Jesus as a child, when there are no children actually in church in most cases, because everybody's kind of traveling or they got Christmas hangover. So the kids don't even hear, and the adults don't hear, that there actually is a decent amount, I mean, not a lot, but there's a decent amount of Jesus, his childhood, mentioned in the scriptures. It's all contained really quick up, and we don't even get out of the second verse or chapter in either Matthew or Luke, but it's there. So we're going to start to unpack what is going on with Jesus' childhood, and then I'm going to look at what childhood would have looked like at that time that Jesus would have been part of, and how we can have some parallels, because Jesus was raised fully human, fully divine. So we sometimes have a tendency to avoid the human part, but we're going to look at that this week. So first up, I want to mention the Nativity. We are so used to having the story that involves the star and the shepherds and the angels and the gifts, and it's 3 wise men, and that's how we always tell it. That's how we encourage children to tell it, and that is not how it's presented in the Bible. First off, the Bible story of the Nativity is in 2 places. We've got Luke's and we've got Matthew's. Luke's is the newborn Jesus in a manger with the shepherds and the angels and the traveling to Bethlehem. Matthew has the toddler Jesus with the Magi and the star and the rushing out to Egypt so that he will not be killed with the rest of the boys that are being killed because of Herod's jealousy and fear of Jesus rising up to be king. They're 2 very different stories, but yet because they're so combined, people forget that. And often what happens is that in our lack of separating them, we read into each other. We're going to encounter where there's a huge example of that in one of the issues that we'll be looking at, particularly with Jesus being presented at the temple. It's a problem because we do not stop long enough to see what is different in each of these Gospels, what the emphasis that's different. I mean, Luke's is all about Mary first. Matthew is about Joseph first. Luke is focused on the poor and the oppressed. Matthew is focused on the comfortable and a whole lot of Gentiles. So they're very different themes, very different energies. And because we've traditionally understood them as only one story, we have to start unpacking that to see a little bit more what's going on. So the very first encounter we have in the Bible with Jesus actually happens before he's even born, and that's the Annunciation. That's when Mary is told, by the way, God chose you, and you're going to have a child. Now, in the last number of years, there's 2 things about Mary that have started to circulate, which are completely false and completely not part of the biblical scripture. One is that she was a child. No, Mary would have been 16, 17 when she got married to Joseph and when she had Jesus. The reason we can know that is because of nutrition. Girls would not have been married until they'd had their first period for the first year and a bit, until they're able to actually have children. The worse the nutrition, the later that is. We in North America tend to be seeing girls having menstruation earlier and earlier based on our obscene amount of protein in our diet, the antibiotics often that are in a lot of these products, and the fact that we rarely have people starving in North America. It happens, believe me, it happens. But as a general rule, the Western world is not hungry. But if you look at Asia or if you look at Africa, we will see that the average age of menstruation is actually older. So in Asia, it is 11, 12, whereas in North America, it is 10, 11, 12. Asia, it's 11, 12, 13. In Africa, Sub-Sahara Africa particularly, it's 12, 13, maybe 14. So we in our own time can see how lifestyle and environment and nutrition influence how late it is a young woman starts to menstruate, and then what age she can just be married. So in ancient Palestine 2,000 years ago, Mary would have been an older teenager, which is in line with almost everything we know through history about when girls tended to get married and start a family. So the notion that Mary was a child is wrong. Part of that notion also is that Mary did not consent. Now, I don't know where people get that. They certainly are not reading Luke, where the angel asks and Mary says yes. So these are two huge myths that have emerged in the last little while to dismiss the stories of Jesus and Christianity as a rule. But if we look at the biblical scriptures, they do not bear out. So getting back to Jesus as an infant, we have the story of the Annunciation, then we have Elizabeth giving birth to John, and then we have Mary and Joseph traveling because of the census. Now, the census there's no historical record of it, the way Luke describes it, because he talks about Quirinius is in power, and when Caesar Augustus is in power, there's no match up there. In fact, the only census that is taken at around that time is Quirinius does in his area of Palestine, in his area of Syria, and there's a revolt at that point in time. There is no correlation to the story of Jesus. In fact, the dates that Quirinius had the census do not match up with the census that Caesar Augustus called. So we cannot we cannot match it up. In fact, most scholars just have decided that Luke is wrong. So there was not something that was matched up. Now, the Caesar did call some census. One was in 2 or 3 CE. One was in about 8 BCE, and another was in 28 BCE. So pick your pick. There's not one that stands out. And there's nothing that demonstrates what that census even found when it was done or where it was done. We don't even know that it was actually done in the Palestinian area. So we don't have much to work on in that regard. But Luke situates us with telling us when this happened, and that because of this, Mary and Jesus had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Now, a lot of the nativity story is stylized. It's not historical. It's a spiritual story, not a historical story. So we've got to work with that. The reason they have to get to Bethlehem is because of a passage in Micah. I think it's Micah 2:8 maybe, that says, "You, Bethlehem, you will be the birthplace of the Messiah, or the Great One." So both Matthew and Luke have to make Jesus born in Bethlehem. Luke has already situated Mary and Joseph in Nazareth, so he has to have a reason for why a pregnant Mary is going to go traveling down to Bethlehem. The census is part of that explanation. So when we get in there, we get Mary, who is the dominant person. We have the birth, and we have Joseph as the secondary person. We have him in the role of midwife, which would have been absolutely unheard of in that day and age. Also, if we're going to get into the historicity of that time and date, I mean, there's a lot of jokes about where if the wise women showed up, they bring casseroles, and women were around when Jesus was born. It's just we got rid of all the women that we could get rid of, and Mary was the only one we couldn't get rid of. These are standard jokes around. The reality is, in that day and age, if Mary and Joseph had been there, they would have been taken in by a family. Mary would have been attended to by women. There would have been no reason for the story as we know it to be shared. So there's a spiritual reason behind this. And the reason behind that is to show that Jesus was different. There was something out of step, out of character of what society was doing. And it's followed through by the fact that we have angels going and talk to shepherds. Now, the thing with the shepherds is they were a lower rung of society, for sure. They were not seen as criminals or bad people, but they had a great deal of suspicion about them because they were the only group of people who stayed outside of the towns and villages and cities during nighttime. Now, there was a profound fear of being in the wilderness. This is why when Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days, it's a big deal, because the bandits, the robbers, are in the wilderness, the wild beasts, they're in the wilderness, but the shepherds manage to live in this scary place. So there's a sense of fear and awe when it comes to shepherds, but they're also not terribly well off people. So we have again the whole narrative of that the first people who show up are the people who society deems the least worthy. That is a theme of Luke, that the high are going to be brought down, the low are going to be brought up, and Mary is part of that process. So we see her as the voice. We see her taking all of these messages, all of this wisdom to heart and holding it tight. Then we move on to the presentation of Jesus in the temple when he's an infant, when he's 40 days old, I believe, at that point in time. Now, there's some interesting things culturally going on there. First of all, when a boy was circumcised in that time, they were circumcised on the 8th day after they were born. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the 7th day God rested, the 8th day everything kind of went the way it was supposed to. So there's a newness associated with the 8th day. But more specifically, ancient people were not dumb. They understood that a woman's menstrual cycle was 7 days. So after 7 days, or up to 7, I guess 4 to 7, after the 7 days, then the woman would have gone through a level of purification because of that blood flow. And then the next day, her son would be circumcised and they would be naming him. She is there. There's often an assumption that when we see that women have specific rituals, especially around birth, that it is a gender bias. Now, I'm not going to suggest there is no gender bias, because obviously there is, but it is a much richer, deeper reason than simply they're a woman, therefore they're treated worse or differently. Mary would have gone through the ritual cleaning. And according to Leviticus 12, it says that women having sons go through essentially 40 days, and women having daughters go through 80 days before they're purified and welcomed back into society. Now, I've had this conversation with some women who have not had children, and they don't have an understanding of what a woman's body goes through in that process. 80 days resting, relaxing, having the women in your community take care of you and your child, that is heaven. Anybody this day and age would like to have that kind of experience. We're hearing about it being about ritual impurity because it's written by men, not by women. We do not understand what is going on with women's culture because it wasn't recorded. Didn't mean it doesn't exist. There's also a theory that was quite widespread at that point in time, and Plato even expanded on it. They believed that boys were formed in the womb faster than girls, so therefore they needed half the time of recovery than girls. That's one theory. Another theory comes from the Book of Jubilees, where it said Adam was made with flank, and then a week later Eve was made, so that explains why a boy child is only there for needs purity for 1 week, and a girl child needs to mark 2 weeks, and then it's doubled again that a man is able to be available twice as fast as a woman is being able to be available. Again, it's theory. It's the Book of Jubilees. It could have been recognized as scripture at this point was going on. We have no way for knowing for sure. Most of Leviticus was written when the Israelite leaders, or the Judean leaders rather, were in exile in Babylon. So some of this stuff would have been made up, and some of this stuff would have been just Luke adding it because it was referenced in Leviticus. Some of this stuff probably was actually lived. But the thing is, to really remember, is that we do not see the women's perspective on this. We only see the men's perspective on this. So this is not about gender. This is about blood flow. There's also assumption that because a girl baby will eventually menstruate, that there is double the time because now you have 2 women who are capable of doing this. So all of these theories could come into play, could not. The fact of the matter is, after birth, there was a time of rest and recovery before a woman was expected to be back in society. And there was a ritual that was done, that they either brought a large animal or they brought a couple of doves. Now, the birds that Joseph and Mary are claiming to have brought are a symbol of not being very wealthy. One of the themes that carries through, and it has a lot to do with liberation theology out of Latin America, is this absolute adherence to Jesus being poor, raised poor. It is such a desired idea that one of the scholars, a Jesuit, decided that the reason Mary and Joseph brought the doves instead of something larger, even though the Magi had given them gold, is that Mary resisted the gold because she, as a virtuous woman, would not want to have any wealth around her. See, that's the combination of the Matthew and Luke story that causes problems for theology and thinking later on. There's a long history of the church actually going in, bending in all sorts of areas, like gymnastics, trying to figure out how to justify assumptions. And this is one of them, that Mary and Jesus and Joseph were always poor. There is nothing in Scripture which actually says that. In fact, we will look at a couple other things that Jesus does that shows that the family probably did have money. But in that story, in that presentation in the temple, we're talking about a couple of people who have been traveling, and they had a child. They probably did not have their wealth with them, if we want to justify any of it at all. And that's why the story is there. It's not as a guarantee demonstration that Jesus was poor. We really don't know. Now, at the time, poor and comfortable were not that far apart, and the wealthy really didn't exist. So we're looking at a variety of financial scales that they would have fallen on. Now, one of the things that Luke's story also does tell us, they highlight this woman named Anna. We're going through Luke's gospel. One of the things that Mary and Elizabeth start right at the beginning is that women have a significant voice in the telling of the story. And it's put in there in surprising ways. So we have a lot of conversation maybe between Jesus and men, but it's the women who get it faster. And right up front, after Mary and Elizabeth, the next woman you meet is Anna, the prophet, who spent most of her adult life in the temple waiting, and she recognizes Jesus right away. This is a theme in all the Gospels, actually, that the women recognize Jesus and understand what's going on far faster than the men do. So we have Anna recognizing Jesus immediately, and what that means is someone who, with Mary, can see the wonder of this child who is just a couple of months old. Moving on from there, then we bounce back into Matthew's version. Matthew's version has Jesus as a toddler. Now, in most English translations, it'll say child, because when the translation were happening, toddler was not a concept. In fact, the entire idea of childhood as something that is set aside and special didn't even exist. That's not something Shakespeare would have known about. It's not something the writers around the time of King James would have known about. It's definitely not something the first century Palestinians would have understood. Toddler was just not a word. But the idea was that Jesus was just a 2-year-old. That's what the Greek word meant, that he would have been that age. So now we have a story where it's Joseph that has the focus. Joseph is the one that has the dreams. Joseph is the one that has the angel visitation. Joseph is the one who decides to keep Mary. They're living in a house in Bethlehem. Very different. They're not traveling. They're actually living there. And we have the story of Herod and Herod's jealousy. And we also have the star and the Magi. The Magi, that's often raised some question too. There's a possibility that they were Zoroastrian priests, possibly scientists, possibly just learned people from Persia. We don't know exactly. The word magi comes from the Greek word that also means magic. And in that day and age, anybody who had studied science and astronomy and any of those things would have seen magical to someone else who did not understand how Earth worked or the seasons worked past the basic need for agrarian knowledge so that you can grow your own crops. So these would have been rich men and women. And that's the other thing. We have a legend of 3 based on 3 gifts. And then in the Middle Ages, around the 1300s, a book came out, I can't remember the book even. It's Golden something. And it came out saying that the names of the wise men, Melchior, Balthazar, and Melchizedek, maybe? I can never remember these names. It's legend from the Middle Ages. It has nothing to do with the scripture in the beginning. The women would have traveled. This would have been families in convoy, especially if they're coming from Persia or anywhere where the former Babylonian territory is. It would not have been safe to cross the desert with just a few people. They would have come as an entourage, and they brought these gifts. And these gifts, again, are symbolic. Matthew is telling just as spiritual a story as Luke is. May have a few more historical accuracies, but it's still a spiritual story. Frankincense would have been used to worship in the temple. Myrrh was used to embalm bodies, prepare bodies for burial. And gold was the scene of the represented riches and kings. So the gifts were symbolic of who Jesus was in society. Not that these are the gifts that a bunch of men who'd never met him thought that a baby needed. Now, how they got to Bethlehem is also a big question. And the star is about the only historically accurate part we have of the entire nativity. Because the star did actually exist. A few years ago, 2020, I believe, we had Jupiter and Saturn lined up, and it was very bright in the sky, and it was called the Christmas star. There's a theory that Jupiter and Saturn lined up 2,000 years ago, and that is what the wise men followed. There's also a theory that a comet flew over, and the wise ones followed that, and that's what got them to Bethlehem. The third theory is that it was Saturn and Venus that lined up. And that's how the brightness of that star, because they got to look like they were one star, that's how they followed. And it's that theory that also puts Jesus' birth in the spring or summer, because that when that happened, Saturn and Jupiter and Venus would have looked like one star around June. And there's years that these things have been identified in. The comet, for instance, was seen by Chinese astronomers as well in 5 BCE. Jupiter and Saturn lining up was symbolic. Also, the meaning of what these planets meant. They meant a king who was extra, essentially. Saturn and Jupiter are both identified with kings, and that was seen in the constellation of Pisces. So Pisces would have been identified with Israel and Judah because that was the fish basket of the Roman world at the time. So all of these symbols would have piled on top of each other. Now, and that was in 7 BCE. In 3 BCE, when Venus and Jupiter lined up, that would be Jupiter king, Venus maiden. So a king was born of a maiden. Any of it fits. So we have no idea which one it was. It could have been something else altogether. But the star is the closest we're going to come to an identifiable date when any of this could have happened. After we leave Matthew, we bounce back into Luke to have the story of Jesus as a 12-year-old. Now, one of the things that often surprises people, especially younger kids and teenagers, is that Jesus' parents didn't know where he was. How could they not know where he was? Because modern kids are used to families traveling together. Well, that wasn't how it was done back then. They'd have these long caravans. The men would be up front. The women and the children would be in the back. Jesus' 12, 13-year-old boy could have been with either parent. Almost a man, he would travel with Joseph, still considered a child, or Mary wanting him to help out with their younger children, would have been in the back. So it's very easy. They wouldn't have known until that night, as the scripture tells us, that he was missing. And then they ran around to see if he'd actually been part of other family and friends. And when they didn't find him then, they raced back to Jerusalem to try to find him. Now, I'm going to sidestep there for a little bit. Jesus' siblings. That is something that we also don't talk about. Matthew and Mark both give us names of brothers plus sisters. They differ on one name, but the names are practically the same for both Matthew and Mark. Now, here's where, again, theology and traditional interpretation has got their conclusion, and then they try to fit everything in it so that it adapts to the assumption. In churches who are convinced of Mary being a perpetual virgin, that means never having sex, never having more children, never having been touched by a man at all, how did they justify Matthew and Mark having all these additional siblings for Jesus? The way they justified it is to say that Joseph was actually very much an older man. His first wife had died. All of these siblings were actually older than Jesus and part of Joseph's first family. That's a contortion we just don't have to make, and it does not fit with Scripture. This is what I mean. When you tie yourself completely to one thought, then you adjust everything to justify that thought. Not only are you messing around with the way Scripture tells us it is, but you're having to do a whole lot of mental gymnastics that just don't make sense. These were the children of Joseph and Mary. Jesus was the big brother. He probably would have helped to the best of his ability because the family would have stayed together until Jesus would have come of age. Then he would have trained with his father, but also a child who had means would have traveled to the synagogue and continued to study both the Torah and the Talmud. Jesus probably did, and there's a few keys that we can look at in that. One is that the story of Jesus being lost in the temple also includes a statement that they went every year. This is a pilgrimage. This is not something the poor were able to do. There were expectations. If you could not afford to do this pilgrimage, you didn't. Most people who had money were expected to be there. And then they had to find places to live, basic accommodation, food, whatever they needed to have, in a city that was crowded. You can't do that without money. So Jesus had some. The other thing we can look at is that later in the Gospels, he's referred to as rabbi. Rabbi not in modern Jewish understanding of rabbi, but rabbi as in teacher. Mary Magdalene addresses him like this. Some of the others address him like this. He would have had the opportunity of further education that a poor family would not have been able to make happen. Jesus wouldn't have been wealthy, but he would not have been dirt poor either. And the family would have done their best to provide for their oldest son, especially knowing what Mary knows about him and Joseph knows about him, would have done their best to make sure he was well educated in the Talmud and the Torah and whatever other scripture was needed of the day. So for him to be sitting with the learneds in Jerusalem would not have been a stretch. It would have been something that was quite common. But the other thing is that it would have symbolized within Luke that Jesus was already an advanced thinker, even as a child and a teenager. So we are ready for him being the source of incredible wisdom when he becomes an adult, because he already has been that as a teenager. Now, one of the really, really interesting things about this is that when Joseph and Mary get back to the temple, it is Mary who challenges Jesus. Where have you been? Why were you not with us? Now, we're talking a patriarchal culture. Mary is the one who is publicly chastising her son. There is something significant in Mary being held up. It puts Joseph again in the secondary place, where he is basically continues the role of midwife, helper. He is not the dominant one in this relationship. But what it also does is it highlights the role of women's involvement with Jesus' ministry. And there's a whole lot of conservative factions within Christianity who want to dismiss women completely and say we didn't have any role in the Bible. We just kind of happened to be there. Not accurate. Here is an example of women, a woman, the woman, being the voice of parental authority to her child, who is God incarnate. So Mary has a significant role in the action and the history of the development of Christianity in the early church in that period of time. So these are the stories that we have of Jesus as a child in the Bible, and they're rich, and we can further enrich them by looking at what childhood was at that point in time. Childhood as we know it, where there's a naivety and a playfulness of it, and everybody wants the magic of the years to happen, that's a relatively modern concept. That can only really be dated back to Victorian era, maybe back into the Enlightenment, and definitely not 2,000 years. Children, traditionally through history, have been workers in the family or in the family business. They were seen as small adults. As soon as they were big enough to have a job, they did it. We can still see some of this in some of the more rural cultures in countries that don't have as strong an economy. You're going to see little girls who are often taking care of their siblings. That would have happened 2,000 years ago. It doesn't happen in the Western world where we've got a lot of wealth. But in countries that don't have a lot of wealth, it's a very common thing. Boys would have been expected to take care of a lot of things for the family, especially if the father had gone, in a culture where families were held together, which the Hebrews were. The other part of the Hebrew culture that did carry on into Judaism is that their understanding of the household economy. Those of us who are in a Christian tradition understand the whole father's head of the household business. They're the ones that work, they're the ones that dictate, they're the ones that essentially decide how things are going to be run, what's going to be bought, all that kind of stuff. Depending on the marriage, depending on the kindness of the man, but it's always at the man's discretion. The Hebrew, the Jewish understanding of that is that a woman's role is the economy of the household. So making sure the house payments are happening and the purchasing is happening and anything that needs to be held or fixed is her job. She's also expected to work outside the home or at least free to work outside the home to contribute to this. So it's a very different sensibility. And this sensibility goes back. We can see it in the scriptures. We can see Priscilla, who was a teacher and a tent maker with her husband. That was their family job. We know of other women who were doctors. We have historic documentation that identifies this. Women who owned stores. They could have been selling their own produce that they raised, or they could have been selling the family stuff. People who were skilled artisans who worked in the companies that were technically their husbands, but they were also a contributor to the arts. In fact, this goes right on into the Middle Ages. We have women running things, being the artisans, being the people. It's not until we get to the Victorian era that we have this assumption that men dictate everything and women are supposed to be quiet at home and hidden away. It wasn't the world that the Hebrew people lived in. One of the other things that was going on in the Hebrew culture is that the children were homeschooled. Now, this was common in the first century. Greeks did it, the Romans did it, the Egyptians did it. Hebrews particularly did it because they also had Holy Scripture. So while other cultures might have educated their children, Hebrew culture educated their children to read. Now, it did not make them literate. Now, this is a distinction. We teach reading and writing together. They did not have the resources to do that earlier in history. That's actually a relatively new idea. They would have taught reading and writing separately. So Jesus, you know how he's playing around in the dirt at one point in time? He probably had some education in how to write when he went to the synagogue schools as a young teenager. But he and his siblings would have learned from their mother, so she had to be educated too. That's why girls were educated, so they could pass on to their own children. She would have been educated too and had to read some of the scripture, maybe all of it. So education was very much a part of the lives of children. They worked and they learned, and they were part of the family rituals. They were part of the family worship services. They contributed however they could. Jesus would have been doing that in his childhood. We have no indication that he was singled out for an easy life. There's nothing that suggests that he did not contribute his share as a child. These are some of the things that helps flesh out the understanding of who Jesus was as a child. His siblings would have been there. He eventually was trained as a carpenter. We have actually, in Mark, a reference to him being a carpenter. In Matthew, we have him being the carpenter's son. But carpenter was very much a part because that's the job Joseph did. The assumption, actually, most historians have come to is that Joseph was working in the Greek town really close to Nazareth, so he would have been gone through most of the day. So it would have been Jesus and Mary and the siblings keeping the home going. That would be the life that he had. So this is the world of Jesus. This is the world of incredible engagement, family involvement, rituals, recognizing what was going on in their culture, being part of everything, wisdom and learning and greatness, who he has as a person, but definitely a childhood that we can teach our children about. So that when they say, was there ever anything in the Gospels about Jesus being a child? We can say, yeah, there's a lot in there, and a lot of it's relatable. And if you are a child or a teenager growing up in a faith community, wanting to have a better relationship with Jesus, looking at Jesus' childhood is the place to start. So thank you very much for being part of this 4th week. Next week, we're going to wrap it up with other children that are in the Christian scriptures. We have far fewer options in the Christian scriptures, less detail, which lends itself to more accurate historical portrayals. I told you when we were doing the matriarchs and the patriarchs that if it's more fanciful, chances are it's less historically honest. But we will be looking at the children that we do find in the Christian scriptures next week. Thank you so much for joining me.